Somewhere right now, someone is standing in a kitchen, 5 minutes into justifying a decision that required at most one sentence. Somewhere else, someone said simply, "I've decided, and that's final." No elaborate defense, no list of reasons, and walked away feeling, for the first time in a long while, like their own life actually belonged to them. Both of them made a decision. Only one of them was still asking permission for it after the fact. There's a specific habit so common, it rarely gets examined directly. The compulsion to justify, in detail, nearly every choice made to coworkers, relatives, acquaintances, sometimes even strangers, regardless of whether an explanation was actually requested or owed. Picture someone declining a social invitation, and instead of simply saying, "I can't make it," offering an elaborate, multi-part account of exactly why: a headache, a prior commitment half remembered, an apology repeated twice, as if the simple decline itself wasn't sufficient on its own to stand as a complete answer. This habit feels in the moment like basic politeness. Examined more closely, it often reveals something else: an underlying belief that decisions require outside approval before they're allowed to be valid. For most people, this pattern didn't start in adulthood. It was built earlier, often in childhood environments where decisions genuinely did require justification to avoid consequences. Picture a child raised in a household where every choice, a friendship, a preference, a way of spending free time, was met with interrogation, requiring a satisfying reason before it was tolerated. This child learns, early and without being explicitly taught, that decisions are provisional until approved by someone else, and that an unexplained choice is inherently risky or suspect. Years later, this same pattern often runs automatically in adult life, not because the original consequences still apply, but because the habit of over-justifying was built deeply enough, early enough, to operate long after the original reason for it stopped being true. It's worth being precise here immediately, because this distinction is the foundation for everything else in this episode. There is a real and important difference between owing genuine accountability to people who are actually affected by a decision, and over-explaining yourself to people who simply asked, without any real claim on your reasoning. Picture someone who owes a business partner, a spouse, or a close collaborator a full, honest account of a decision that directly affects them. This is legitimate accountability, and nothing in this episode argues against providing it fully and honestly. Now picture the same person offering an equally elaborate justification to a distant acquaintance who asked a casual question purely out of small talk, with no actual stake in the outcome at all. The first situation calls for real explanation. The second calls, at most, for a brief, friendly answer, and treating both situations identically is where the habit this episode is naming actually causes harm. There's a specific counterintuitive effect worth naming directly. The more a person justifies a decision, past a certain point, the less confident it tends to sound, even though the intention behind the extra words is usually the opposite. Picture someone stating a boundary in two very different ways. In the first version, they say simply, "I won't be able to help with that this time." In the second, they add 3 additional paragraphs of justification, apology, and preemptive defense against objections that haven't even been raised yet. The second version, despite containing far more words, often reads as considerably less confident than the first, because the sheer volume of justification signals, often correctly, that the person delivering it doesn't quite believe their answer will be accepted on its own, and is working hard to control a reaction in advance rather than simply letting the answer stand. Here is a specific useful discipline worth naming directly and practicing deliberately. On its own, without anything attached to it, no is already a complete, valid, and sufficient answer. Picture someone practicing this directly, being asked for something they don't want to give, and responding with a simple, calm, "No, I can't," rather than the reflexive, automatic paragraph of justification that usually follows. This feels exposed the first several times it's attempted, because it removes the usual buffer of explanation that most people rely on to soften a decision others might not like. But a refusal doesn't actually become more valid by being longer. It becomes valid the moment it's decided. The explanation attached afterward is, in most everyday situations, optional generosity, not a requirement for the no to count. Underneath most over-explaining sits a specific, often unexamined feeling. Guilt, a sense that disappointing someone, even slightly, requires compensation in the form of extra words, extra justification, extra effort to soften the blow. Picture someone turning down a request, feeling a wave of guilt immediately afterward, and responding to that guilt by adding more and more explanation, as though enough justification might eventually neutralize the discomfort of having said no at all. This rarely works. The guilt usually isn't actually about the specific decision. It's a more general discomfort with being the source of someone else's disappointment, however minor or reasonable the disappointment might be. Recognizing this distinction matters, because no amount of additional explanation resolves guilt that was never really about the explanation's adequacy in the first place. Not everyone who asks for a reason has an equal claim to receiving a detailed one, and learning this distinction is central to correcting the pattern this episode describes. Picture ranking the people in a typical week by how much genuine stake they actually have in a given decision. A spouse or close family member directly affected by it, a close friend who has consistently shown up for you, versus a casual acquaintance, a distant relative, or someone whose only involvement is idle curiosity. The first category has earned real access to your reasoning. The second, generally, has not, and treating a passing question from the second category as though it demanded the same depth of justification as the first quietly exhausts a limited resource that would be better reserved for people who've actually earned it. This pattern shows up in a specific practical way whenever someone is in a position requiring decisiveness, leading a team, raising children, managing a household, and it's worth naming directly, because the cost here is often functional, not just emotional. Picture a parent who, every time they set a rule or a boundary with a child, attaches an elaborate justification rather than a simple, clear statement. Over time, the child learns that every boundary is negotiable, provided enough counter-argument is offered, because the parent's own behavior signaled that the rule required winning an argument to stand, rather than simply being a decision already made. The same pattern plays out with a manager over-justifying every decision to a team, or a leader over-explaining every call to people who ultimately need clarity and direction, more than they need a persuasive case. A degree of explanation builds trust. Excessive justification, past a certain point, quietly signals that authority is up for negotiation. There's a specific, sharper cost worth naming. Sometimes, the act of explaining a decision at length doesn't just weaken how it's received by others. It actively erodes the person's own confidence in the decision itself. Picture someone who made a clear, considered choice, and then, while explaining it repeatedly to a skeptical friend or relative, starts noticing their own justification sounding weaker with each additional layer added in response to pushback. By the end of the conversation, they've often talked themselves out of a decision that was, at the outset, perfectly sound, not because new information emerged, but because the sheer repetition of defending it eroded their own certainty simply through the act of over-explaining it under pressure. This is one of the more insidious costs of this habit. It doesn't only affect how others perceive a decision. Left unchecked, it can quietly undo the person's own conviction in choices that never actually needed defending in the first place. Within close relationships specifically, over-explaining tends to produce an effect opposite to its intention. Rather than building trust, it can quietly erode respect over time. Picture a partner who, every time a minor disagreement arises, responds with an extended, anxious justification rather than a calm, clear statement of their position. Over months and years, the other partner may begin to sense, often without being able to name exactly why, a subtle decline in respect for someone who never seems fully settled in their own positions, always working overtime to justify rather than simply stating things plainly and letting them stand. Calm, brief clarity, even when it holds a position the other person disagrees with, tends to earn more genuine respect over time than anxious over-justification ever does, even when the over-justification is offered with entirely good intentions. Correcting a habit this deeply automatic requires deliberate, repeated practice, not a single decision to simply stop. Picture starting small. The next time an explanation feels compulsively necessary for something minor, deliberately giving a shorter answer than instinct suggests. One sentence, without the usual 3 additional sentences of justification trailing behind it, and simply sitting with the discomfort that follows, rather than filling it reflexively. This will feel exposed at first, the same way any new discipline discussed throughout this series feels uncomfortable in its early stages. With repetition, the discomfort tends to fade considerably faster than most people expect, replaced by a specific, quiet confidence in having let a short, sufficient answer simply stand on its own. To be clear, as stated at the outset, this episode is not arguing for withholding genuine communication, avoiding accountability, or being needlessly terse with people who are legitimately owed a full account of something. Picture a situation genuinely requiring real explanation, a serious decision affecting a spouse's life plans, a mistake made at work that a colleague needs to understand fully in order to move forward, a change in a close friendship that deserves an honest, complete conversation rather than a clipped, vague dismissal. In these situations, real, generous explanation is not the problem this episode describes. It's exactly the kind of accountability discussed in Chapter 3, offered to people who have genuinely earned it. The distinction remains the same one running through this entire episode. Explaining fully to people with a genuine stake in the outcome is healthy communication. Over-explaining to everyone, regardless of their actual claim on the decision, out of habitual guilt or fear of disapproval, is the pattern actually being addressed here. At the center of everything discussed in this episode sits a single underlying shift, building enough internal confidence in a decision that it no longer requires an audience's approval to feel settled and complete. Picture someone who has made a decision they genuinely believe in, and who can hold that belief privately, without needing every person who questions it to eventually come around and agree. This doesn't mean becoming closed off to genuine feedback or refusing to reconsider anything. It means the decision's validity was never actually dependent on universal agreement in the first place. A person who has built this kind of quiet internal confidence finds that the compulsive need to explain themselves to everyone gradually loses its grip, not because they've stopped caring what anyone thinks, but because their own sense of a decision being valid no longer requires everyone else's signature on it. There is something quietly significant about a reason that exists purely for yourself, never spoken aloud, never offered up for anyone else's evaluation or approval. Picture someone making a private decision, holding the reasoning behind it entirely to themselves, offering only the decision itself when asked, without feeling any need to defend the reasoning underneath it to anyone who wasn't genuinely entitled to it. This is not secrecy for its own sake, and it's not deception. It's simply the recognition that not every part of a person's inner reasoning is public property, owed to whoever happens to ask. Reasons held privately without needing to be justified to an audience, tend to feel more solid and more genuinely one's own than reasons constantly offered up for external approval and debate. Like everything else explored throughout this series, this shift is never accomplished through a single decisive moment. It's built the same quiet way discipline, patience, silence, and every other quality discussed in this series are built through small, repeated choices that rarely feel significant on their own. The short answer given instead of the automatic paragraph of justification. The explanation reserved for the people who've genuinely earned it, rather than offered freely to anyone who asks. The guilt noticed and released, rather than obeyed through more and more words. The private reason held quietly, without needing anyone else's approval to feel valid. None of it happens all at once, but it accumulates quietly into someone whose decisions no longer require a defense to feel complete, and whose silence, where an explanation once would have gone, is read correctly, not as evasion, but as a person who has finally stopped waiting for permission to live their own life. That is what it means to stop explaining yourself. Not because you owe no one anything, ever, but because you finally learned who actually deserves the reason and who is only ever asking out of habit. If this reached you today, share it with someone who needs the reminder.